am so glad to have you on with me today. And I've got to tell you, the moment that movie was first advertised, my husband turned to me and said, "Let's go this weekend." I mean, and we went, and it was so brilliantly done. Everything about it, and it seemed so sincere and genuine, authentic, I guess is the word I'm looking for. The acting was brilliant, everything about it. And then I came to understand from your book that it took 19 years for you to complete that project from beginning to end. And so I just wanted to start off asking you this question. That seems like a long time. Do most films in Hollywood take 19 years to come to the box office?
Well, some, like the Chronicles of Narnia, take 50 years. So, it all depends on your perspective. But yeah, I think the thing with those of us who work in Hollywood and movies is we're always working on multiple projects. And so it's not like I sat around for 19 years trying to get this made. So we're doing other things, but at the same time, you have to keep the ship kind of rolling. But there's just a lot of things that have to happen for a film to come to fruition. The talent, financing, the distribution. Hopefully, there's no pandemic going on. There's just a lot of factors that all the stars have to line up, and so it just takes a long time. But I noticed that people that are far more important than me, like a Martin Scorsese, Spielberg, they also take a long time. It took Scorsese 25 years to make that Silence movie of his. So I don't feel so bad because I'm not as important as they are. So 19 years, a third of my life, it is what it is.
When I watch a really good movie, especially one that is historic in nature, I'm just always fascinated by the complexity of you just when you stop watching the movie as being in the movie and walking through the movie with the characters and the storyline, and you start thinking of the sets and everything that has to be brought together, the costuming and just every last detail. And I especially enjoy that when I'm looking at something from an era that I lived through. But I for instance, I love 70s movies, or stories that look back to the 70s. It's so campy. And for the 80s, well, actually, of course, when does this start? We start off with the assassination in the Reagan movie, but then it just goes straight to his childhood at that point, correct?
Right. So we're back to about 1922 or so.
Yeah. And it was beautifully, beautifully done. The movie seems to me that it's really about a man and his destiny, that God had a purpose.
Thanks for noticing. Yeah, that really is that each of us has a purpose and a destiny. And, my original director was going to be John Avildsen. And I chose John because he was the director of Rocky. And he's 81 years old. And, in the States, we kind of throw people away after a certain age. But, I grew up in Japan, and I think I must have a respect for elders that normal Americans don't have, because I'm trying to find John Avildsen. And I found him. And he really hadn't worked in a while, but he was still alive and kicking. And so John and he ended up passing away, and he wasn't able to direct the film. But we had quite a bit of time where he was going to be the director, and we'd worked out his contract and all. But anyway, John would tell me that this movie is about destiny and purpose. And he said, Rocky is not really about boxing. Boxing happens to be the backstory of the man and all that he has to overcome. And he's like, don't forget that. This movie is not about politics per se. It's really about the man and all that he has to overcome, and the fact that he doesn't find his purpose until he's 69 years old. And so that was really always stayed with me. I was always hoping that this movie commercials would say, from the director of Rocky comes Reagan, but we couldn't quite get there. But he did leave his imprint with us.
But that was wise advice. And it seems to me that the best movies really are about the people in the movie, and they're so memorable. But we don't get very many movies about people like Ronald Reagan that are laudatory. And I know that you were not, you didn't, you showed all of Reagan, and you showed the difficulties in his life and the failures in his life, or perceived failures, that kept him directed on this road to destiny. But so it wasn't an uncritical look at Reagan, but it seems to me that the story of the man is what is inspiring to all people as well, because, do you have a destiny? Do I have a destiny? All of us in this world, I think, hope that our lives are leading to an ultimate good, or that we have contributed something, we've pleased God, and we've done well in our life by our brethren, our neighbor, our country. Is that why it's inspiring?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks for noticing. I appreciate that you noticed that we did have a lot of his failures and imperfections in there. And it was just almost like people just wanted, the critics want to see him be hammered. He's evil. It's like, no, he's just a regular guy. But he did have difficulties. There wasn't like, I spent 15 plus years researching him, and, I couldn't find a dark side. It's not like, close the doors and say, let's go kill babies or whatever. There wasn't that, But the dark side is really about a lot of failure or almost success. And, he was not a great radio announcer, but he was a radio announcer. He was not a great actor in Hollywood, but he was an actor. So he had a lot of things that were, and if you look back in retrospect, you can see that it's preparation. All those things were preparation for what he had to do eventually. And he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. What did that teach him? Well, it taught him how to negotiate. The TV work taught him how to communicate. And so all these things were preparation. And so you can kind of look back on a life like that. But yeah, we did. I've got him being broken up with by a teenage sweetheart. Wife leaves him. He's in Vegas throwing a beer bottle against the wall because he's really at the lowest point of his career. So we know that. And then also the fun part was I also wanted to make sure that there's a bit of, retrospective untruth right now that, everybody loved Reagan. He was everybody's favorite grandfather. Well, it's like, no, I was around in the 80s, and some of my friends absolutely hated Reagan, and their parents hated Reagan, and it was a deep-seated hatred. He would be burned in effigy in the streets, and his own daughter is marching against him in anti-nuclear marches. So, let's put away the everybody loved Reagan thing. That's not true. There was about, I'd say, 40% of the country that always really strongly disliked him. So I wanted to make sure we captured, and so we have an entire minute of scenes of protesters and all their different signs, anti-nuke signs and vaccines and this and that and the other thing, everything you could imagine, AIDS. So I did want to at least acknowledge that. And, the fun part was I had my music supervisor try to get the song Land of Confusion by Genesis, because that was like one of the great anti-Reagan songs of the 80s. And initially, the Genesis folks said, absolutely not. No way. We want to be part of a Reagan movie. Well, so I had my guy go back and say, look, guys, we're going to pay you money, and your song will be over all the protest scenes of why Reagan was so bad. Like, this is why you wrote the song. This is literally the dream of why you wrote the song. And they said, okay.
We'll take the money. Let me introduce a personal note here. Ronald Reagan was very, very, I think, a pivotal person in many people's lives. And I'm going to tell you my personal experience. I remember my mother, her friend, was telling me, and I did not have a deep biblical understanding at that point in my life, that Ronald Reagan wanted to bring in the apocalypse. This was a serious conversation that he was having with me. And of course, I really did not understand the book of Revelation, Zechariah, whatever, the various end time scenarios. And I saw that was really what was being implied in the press. That's scary. That's sort of like the Hitler thing today. Like, this guy is a madman that wants to bring about nuclear war and the end of the ages, because he's like believes in God. in the Bible. The King James, by the way, the mighty King James. But anyway, then with my husband, he was a radical leftist from the time he was about 15 years of age. I mean, a radical leftist, anti-war protester. He went the entire gamut, and his brother as well, John. And when he voted for Ronald Reagan, he finally woke up. He went from this radical, supporting of, Jane Fonda and every radical thing you could support. And he ends up voting for Reagan and waking up. He had a transition in his life, and he came to the knowledge of the truth that the direction that he was going was crazy and that Ronald Reagan made sense. And then my Catholic mother, who, of course, was raised that, Kennedy's are royalty. All Catholics have to vote for Democrats. She's Irish Catholic. And she said, I was sitting outside of the polling area, and I was in my car, and I said a prayer to God and asked him to forgive me. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to do this, but I was going to go vote for Republican Ronald Reagan. And so these are I think all of us had stories like this during that because of Ronald Reagan, because he was such a pivotal personality and historic figure in our history.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. People don't quite understand how large he loomed over us in the 80s. It's really unlike, I suppose Trump and Obama have similar effects on certain groups. But I think for all of America, as Dennis Quaid would often say, he was our dad, for better or for worse. Sometimes you liked your dad, sometimes you didn't like your dad. But he was like our dad. And, a lot of us, including myself, wrote letters to him when we were kids. It was really bizarre. My wife, who's not the most political human being in the world, she wrote a letter to Ronald Reagan inviting him to dinner when she was like 12 years old. Well, who does that? It's a little bizarre, but that was how we felt about him. Like she actually thought he would come to her house in Fargo, North Dakota for dinner. And I've talked to people who have written similar letters to him. And, Reagan got so many letters like that from kids, especially, that he had a team of women who read those letters. And he would say, hey, if anything jumps out at you, you bring it to me. And so there was one lady in particular who wrote him a letter saying she was short on a bill that she needed to pay and she needed some money, whatever. And so he sent her a check. Well, she refused to cash the check because it's a check from the President of the United States. Well, he wrote her a second letter saying, keep this check and cash the other one. So it was really a unique relationship that I think this generation can't quite figure out. But yeah, he was our dad for better or for worse. And sometimes you liked your dad. Sometimes you, as I said, his own daughter, Patty, is literally marching in the streets, against her dad. Brought the anti-nuke activists to the White House to meet with him. And so it was just a unique time, and he was a unique figure.
Mark, do you think that that Ronald Reagan had that effect on people because we sensed that he really cared about America and about people? To me, there was a warmth about him, and he also had an authoritative confidence that I think that we all appreciate. But I don't feel the same way about all presidents. Of course, I disagree with obviously I'm very political, so no doubt I don't feel about Obama and Biden the same way. But I feel like he and Trump, and I'd like your comments at some point. I'd love you to flesh out how Trump and Reagan are similar and dissimilar. But I feel like I know they care about people.
Yeah. I think you can see politicians really have to care about people to be a good politician. You can see it in Bill and Hillary Clinton. Whatever their faults are, you can see that Bill really likes people and Hillary doesn't. Let's just be honest. When they go into a room, you can tell that Hillary's like, when can I get out of here? And Bill's like, I'm going to greet every last person in this room and win them over so that they'll like me. And people can tell that, and they want somebody that cares. And so for whatever his faults were, Bill liked people and cared about them, wanted to hear their stories. think Reagan was the same way. Obama, there's a bit of a coldness there. But one thing about Reagan that was probably critical to his formation and becoming a politician is the time he spent on the GE lecture circuit. So he's traveling from city to city and meeting the guys in hard hats with their names in cursive on their shirts. And if Mitt Romney had done that for a sustained period of time, he might be president. But you have to have Reagan, that period of time, I think it was 6 or 8 years, gave him a sense of the fears and the hopes and the dreams of the American people and what they were concerned about and cared about. With Trump, you have a bit of that because he does connect with the hard hat crew, and he has spent some time, on his construction sites. He knows those people well. But that's a really important thing for a politician, and I think that Reagan did that well. I think Clinton, he's in Arkansas after all, and he did, like to go into McDonald's and hang out with people, and so yeah, that comes through, and you really can't fool people about that. They can tell if you want to be there or if you're looking at your watch. Remember George Bush literally looking at his watch, saying, "When can I get out of this debate and go home?"
Of course, after Carter, anybody would be a superstar, I would think. But tell me more about what hurdles you faced with regard to this movie. And I'd brought up the question as to, why we don't have more movies about men like Reagan. And it was actually pointed toward the fact that Reagan was so demonized, just as Trump is. And for Hollywood to make a movie about Ronald Reagan that would be anything other than a swipe at his character, his legacy, and all that, it would be almost unthinkable. And did you face that kind of opposition when you made the movie?
Yeah, I would say there's two sides to Hollywood. I think in the past there have been some very ideological people, but there's also a side of Hollywood that just is about business. And so, I'll give you an example. One of my good friends who runs a studio, he's literally a card-carrying member of the ACLU, but he loves to put out movies of all different persuasion. And so he was really hoping to get this movie. We couldn't work it out, unfortunately. But there are people like, he's in business, and he's an old-fashioned liberal, and liberal means all points of view. But there is another side to Hollywood that's a darker side that, punishes movies if they're about people like a Reagan, for instance. But in our case, I've been around for a long time, and I've been a part of about 75 movies in one way or another, developing, producing, marketing, whatever. And so I kind of know the terrain, and I did not want to make this with a studio, but I was glad to partner with a studio after we were done. So that just gives me the creative freedom that I wanted. I didn't want to have to answer to anybody or make any changes that I didn't want to make. So we partnered with Universal, with Lionsgate, Showbiz. So we have great partners, and they did their job of getting the movie out and distributing it around the world. But we had our own, creative bubble that we could do what we wanted. I will say that, I screened for 3,000 people in 11 states in preparation and made a lot of tweaks based on that. And it was really, really, originally you didn't meet Dennis Quaid until 25 minutes of the film. And I had people going, "What's going on here? We came to see Dennis Quaid.
Yeah.
Why are we spending time on this kid?" So I was like, "Oh, you're right. Yeah."
Because it's
totally
kind of fascinating to see Dennis Quaid play Ronald Reagan and do it so well. I mean, you could see how he would be a natural at it, but to see him on the screen playing Reagan, it's as close as you can get to seeing the real thing.
Yeah, I begin the book at the very, very beginning when I'm driving. I'm driving with my wife in the Midwest somewhere to a cousin's wedding, and I get pulled over for speeding. And just to set the stage, I've got myself, and I think it was 3 or 4 daughters at the time, under the age of 5 or 6, and I'm in a minivan, so I can't be going too fast. And I pull over for speeding, and the officer says, "You have to appear in person in court. Like, you can't just check." And but it said you must appear in Dixon, Illinois. And all of a sudden, I realized I'm driving through Ronald Reagan's hometown. And so I had to spend the night in Ronald Reagan's hometown. And that's when the first inkling hit me that I was supposed to make a movie on Reagan. I was there against my will. And but what really struck me, Elizabeth, was nothing against Dixon, Illinois, but it's just an average town. All I could see was a gas station, a Holiday Inn, and a Pizza Hut or something. Just not a lot happened. And I thought, this is interesting. This is kind of where our leaders come. Just to pick on Japan as an example, prime ministers are often the sons or grandsons of a previous prime minister, and they kind of pass the baton on. Other countries are the same way. Philippines, it's like it's a Marcos or it's a this, and we don't do that here. Our leaders, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Joe Biden or Reagan or Obama or Clinton, they're often, except with the exception of, let's say, a Trump or the Bushes or the Roosevelts, they're really normal people from normal places. And so normal places give birth to great America. And that really struck me.
And that's why that's like the American dream, because the American dream is not to be filthy rich or super famous. The American dream is to be able to fulfill that destiny, whether you're born in a little tiny town with a gas station. And, well, of course, we don't know what it was like before the hollowing out of the industrial America, but of a little town in the Midwest, and being able to take your life and your dreams as far as that you can make them go. And that is truly the American dream. And that's why we have presidents like that. And I would say, though, that with President Trump, he feels like that kind of a guy. I know everything, all of his furniture is covered in gold, and I know he's very wealthy, and his dad was no schmo when it comes to money. But I got to tell you that he's the richest, most ordinary guy in the world, in the sense of like he's an American. And yes, he made that great wealth, and this great fame and all the rest, I think, with God's direction as well. But he seems like an ordinary guy to me.
Well, remember, his mother was an immigrant. So there's a very strong connection there. She just happened to marry a guy who gave him the money. But he doesn't have the sort of Mitt Romney, silver spoon in his mouth attitude. Remember when Mitt Romney was talking about his rotating garages where his cars could go up and down in San Diego, and just a real, he spent too much time with elite people and wealthy people and wealthy
Ross
circles.
Perot was like that too. I remember, this is decades ago, reading like Parade magazine in the Sunday newspaper, that little insert that used to be there when we read newspapers. And I remember reading that he drove around in, a 10, 12-year-old station wagon, 20-year-old station wagon, and that he always told his employees, executives and everything, you know what, if you want to work over your 8 or 9 hours, then don't stay here late at night. Get up in the morning. Your kids don't care about you at breakfast. They want you home for dinner. And that just seemed like a regular kind of a guy, a regular American way. Of course, he didn't win, but he did stir things up.
Yeah. Well, I said, and you asked about Quaid earlier, to find that person who could play this role. I mean, that was a huge challenge. And I spent quite a few years talking to different actors and getting feedback and showing the script. And Dennis was always my first choice, but his actors' schedules are such that it's very, very difficult to plan a movie like this. It's just so big.
Right.
And so he wasn't available for a good chunk of the time. So I talked to others as well. But I always felt Dennis just has that natural Reagan smile and charisma. He's from Texas, kind of like Dixon, Illinois. His mother was very devout. His father's an alcoholic. He is married to a famous actress who overshone him for a while. It was really eerie how similar the two were. And so when I made the offer to him, I took him out to dinner in Malibu at a restaurant called Gladstone's, which Dick Reardon owned. We had a great dinner, and I said, I would love for you to play the role. And I gave him a replica Reagan cowboy hat. And so he said he would think about it. And he called me about 2 weeks later. And I'll never forget, I recounted in the book, but his name came up on my screen. And he said, I tried that hat on, but it's just too big. It doesn't fit. And I thought, he's going to say no. And he said, but I think I can grow into it. The next couple of years growing.
To me, he seems like just a very genuine man for an actor. And it would be hard. Yeah. I mean, you can't take somebody who is too puffed up, thinks too much of themselves, isn't sort of a down-to-earth kind of a person and put him in the Reagan role. So it was a genius pick. Did you immediately think of him?
Yeah, he was my first choice. I mean, I talked to others, and I recount in the book kind of different names that we talked about it. Also, I really wanted somebody who really wanted it, not just like it was a job. But, at one point, I had talked for about a year with Nicolas Cage about the role. That would have taken a lot of hair and makeup.
Yeah.
But one person, Jim Caviezel was somebody we talked to. He had entire Reagan speeches memorized. And I think Dennis has kind of unique charm. He's got that smile, kind of an effortless grin. He had a ranch in Montana.
He ticked all the boxes.
Yeah, he really did it. And I kind of warned him, this is going to be a lot of work. We're going to spend a lot of time in media. He did a ton of interviews for us. So it really was for me, Dennis and I were on the road doing interviews, and it was funny because he did an interview at 10 a.m. And I think he said this was like his second favorite movie of all time that he'd been in. But by 2 p.m., he said, this is my favorite film of my entire career. So something happened in 4 hours. But, as a producer, to have a guy who's been in 152 movies and some American classics say that this is a favorite, that's about as high as it gets for me. So it was really a great thing.
Well, a movie like this has a long shelf life. I mean, it's got legs. It's gonna last, because when somebody wants to see an historical film, or a film about a president, or something about Ronald Reagan, who are you going to call? I mean, what are you going to watch? This is the film. This is the film. It's like doing a movie on Winston Churchill or Margaret Thatcher. This is the go-to. And so it's I think quite an accomplishment for his resume as well.
Well, we a lot of time with the people that knew Reagan. I think about 50, 55 of his aides that I spent time with and got their stories. And it's just funny because a lot of them will just drop stories and not realize the significance of it. And I'm like, did you put that in your book? I'm like, no, I'm just remembered it today. My favorite story was Mike Curb, who used to be Lieutenant Governor of California. One day, we did the deal with Mike for our records, for our soundtrack, because Mike has a big record label, Curb Records. And one day Mike goes, oh yeah, Reagan and I wrote some songs together. And I said, excuse me, Ronald Reagan, the songwriter? He goes, oh yeah, we wrote a couple of songs. And I said, were they ever released? He says, no, they're just sitting around my office. And so I said, well, could you send them to me? And, sure enough, they were kind of 70s, 70s type songs. But I took one of them called Start the World Over Again. And I said, I thought, who'd be the best person to finish this song and record it for our special soundtrack? And I thought, Lee Greenwood was kind of Reagan's favorite, God bless the USA. So called up Lee and I said, Lee, would you take this song and give it your own twist? And so he jumped in, he finished the lyrics, and then he recorded it called Start the World Over Again. And so just things like that, we're just kind of lost to history.
That one of my favorite thoughts about Ronald Reagan is when I found out that he used to write his scripts for his radio show on just a yellow pad in longhand, and they weren't being scripted for him, because one of the ways they used to tarnish his image was to imply that essentially he had somebody else writing all of his words, his scripts. He was just sort of a front man with people behind him, or he was vacuous and just kind of an empty suit or whatever. And that was never true. And when you find out that Ronald Reagan was writing these brilliant scripts longhand on a yellow pad, which you can't fake that. And I remember also the clip talking about the King James Bible. And I just thought, what a side of a man I never knew about, that he would think so deeply about a particular version of the Bible, and that it was from the perspective of maintaining cultural continuity and a connection among all Christians, because they could share a Bible because today in church, if somebody's reading a Bible verse, half the time you're saying, wait a minute, what is that verse? Because so many of the translations are so different. I thought, how unique. He was a thinker.
Yeah, he was a voracious reader. I think when he first got to Washington, Clark Clifford, the dean of Washington intelligentsia, called him an amiable dunce. And in a way, I think Reagan kind of enjoyed that because he liked. He was not a dumb man. Just a couple of quick things that I learned about him that I think are widely known. On the red carpet for film premieres, he would line up on the facing the camera on the very right-hand side. So as you face the red carpet, he'd be on the very left-hand side. And of course, Errol Flynn or somebody in the middle. Now you're thinking, what a modest man. Well, he wasn't being modest. He knew that he'd be mentioning the captions first, left to right, Ronald Reagan, if he positioned himself on the very left side. You'll never see a picture of Reagan with his arm around people because that would rumple the suit. And so everything is thought out. He's not a dummy, right? And so I think even the idea of being mocked by people, in his mind, this is great because it'll lower their expectations and their defenses will be down against me, and they won't think that I'm going to defeat them because they think I'm a stupid guy who's taking naps all the time. So I think in a way he cultivated that. He encouraged the idea that, he's just an old man taking a nap. Well, that old man taking a nap, helped bring down a mighty Soviet empire. And so I think he used it to his advantage, and he didn't mind that people thought that of him because he would take the win in the end.
Do you think his legacy has grown and has increased in stature and admiration over the years since his passing?
Yes and no. I think President Trump has, there's a good chunk of the new right that sort of sees Reagan as too soft and that Trump is the fighter. So there is a whole school of thought among that group. For instance, on immigration, that Reagan allowed for 3 million illegals to be legalized with the promise, of course, that the border would be shut down. Fairness
with
to
the
him.
Fake promise, and he just believed that there was going to be maybe some integrity and honesty in all this because he was promised that that's it. We're going to shut down that border and this will be the one and only amnesty.
The fellows and I made a deal. Well, that's so.
And then I came to realize, exactly. Then I came to realize because somebody else pointed this out to me. Well, that was the end of a Republican California. I mean, I'm not saying that there are a lot of Republicans in California and that it ended right then, but what that massive amnesty. And then what followed thereafter, which was not a curtailing of illegal or legal immigration, eventually moved the state of California to the left. I don't know how true that is, but I do think it had an effect. I'm not sure.
But if you'll notice in the movie, movies are about characters and the development of the character, and it's really a seminal moment. On the airplane when Nancy at not Watergate, at Ron-Contra, she says to him, you've got to fight. And that's the moment where I think he goes from being his mother's son. His mother was optimistic, believed the best in everybody. He goes from being his mother's son to his wife's husband. And she says, they are going to destroy you and you have got to fight. And so there was a part of Reagan that always believed the best in people, and sometimes he would get snookered in deals. And so when he goes to Reykjavik, a couple of his more conservative aides were very concerned that he was going to make a bad deal in Reykjavik, for instance. But he doesn't. He walks away. And so that's part of the character arc. But I think with Reagan and Trump, it's a fascinating contrast. You have to remember where they came from. Reagan comes from a very polite Dixon, Illinois. Everybody's nice to each other, good people. He is not even really aware of racism until much later in life. He grew up with his best buddy, Bergie, on the football team. He's black, he's white. Now, he did encounter racism at one point on the football team when they were at an away game and the hotel wouldn't take black players. And so Reagan brings them his house. But I think Trump's growing up in New York, right? He learned he's fighting with unions and politicians. And his life is a battle. And so he's a New Yorker. He's going to punch back 10 times harder when you punch him. Reagan tends to be, if you punch him, he'll just deflect it, kind of flick you off his shoulder. No big deal. They both win, but Trump wins by counterpunching and leaving, pummeling his opponents. Reagan kind of had the art of defeating you, but making you feel good. I had a line in the film where Gorbachev says, they say about you, you pick people's pockets and make them feel good about it. And there is something to that Reagan had that ability, kind of a velvet.
He did. I can't even imagine anybody not liking Ronald Reagan. He was just such a gentleman, and I don't know. It's just like crinkly, that sparkle in his eye and that little grin, and he just like you'd want to go up and hug him. But I think that there's something very similar in that dissimilarity between President Trump and President Reagan, and that is that they do listen to people and take them at their word, pretty much. I know that might not sound, maybe some people would disagree with me, but I think somebody gets in President Trump's ear and says, look, we don't have enough workers in America. We just have, 17 million unemployed minimum in America, but they'll tell, we don't have enough workers in America. And he's listening to this great argument. And I think he can be persuaded, whether that is in the right direction, whether it's true or not. And with Reagan, like you said, I think that he had an amiable attitude toward people, which is an accepting one. You're taking people at their words. So even though Trump is really, really tough and abrasive in some ways, I think of him as somebody who's very willing to move, sometimes maybe in a direction I don't approve of, compromising, but in other ways, I think he'll just come back and say, I've rethought this. It's okay. I've changed my mind. So
he's a fascinating figure. He reminds me of one of the old generals, of the 1800s, or even like a General Pat or a MacArthur. There's that kind of quality. He's like from a different era, a different century. But it's fascinating to watch. I mean, as a news junkie like I am, it's like if I'm away from the news for 3 hours, I'm like, hey, what did he say now? What did he do now? It's fascinating that we're living in. And
I have never lived at in a time like this second administration, because you cannot leave. What you just said, I'm just going to say it myself. I'll walk out of the room, go do something for 2 or 3 hours, and suddenly either the sky's falling or rainbows or there's some major conflict and X's blowing up. Oh my gosh, I went to the grocery store.
Right. I just say, Trump's critic. I would just say, I think that you should be very thankful that he's not a militaristic person. Because imagine if he was a militaristic type and with this personality he has, but he's not. Ironically, in the first administration, I noticed there were many times when a normal president would have dropped some bombs on so-and-so and so-and-so. And, you could tell Trump just held back. Now, I think that unpredictability really rattles dictators like in North Korea and China and Russia, because they just don't know what he's going to do. And it's kind of the madman theory, which worked to his advantage. But I mean, he's not a particularly militaristic type person. He doesn't seem to, and I think in his mind, it's a calculus. Like, do I want to spend $8 million in a bomb on that guy? I think he's actually thinking through like the financial repercussions of a bomb, and is like, why would I waste that money on that guy in the tent somewhere when we can save that money? And so, I think his critics should be thankful for that.
I think that it is very strange when they see, or they claim to see, in Donald Trump some sort of dictatorial type character, because if he were, he would be doing the opposite of what he's doing. I mean, he's actually listening to the Supreme Court when I would probably say, no, I'm ignoring you if I were president for the day. I don't think it's I think it's more
I think it's more of the characters of a guy who's run his own business, for 50 years or whatever it is. He's just used to calling the shots. And so I don't see it as dictatorial as much as a one-man show, Trump organization, and, what he wants happens. So I think it was a great challenge for him to go, wait a minute, I have to get congressional approval for this, or the court has to say. It's just part of being a businessman in New York, running your own shop. And I think it's a challenge to get used to that. But, there are guardrails, and there are people who, if something crazy happened, I know that people would say, you shouldn't do this, Mr. President. But in a way, Ronald Reagan had people around him that kept him from doing what he wanted to do. Just to give you a couple of, he promised in the campaign to recognize Taiwan, promised to get rid of the Department of Education. Well, once you become president, if somebody came in the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, that was a nice idea, but we just can't do that, sir. And so you would get talked out of stuff. There's nobody to tell Trump in this administration he can't do. James Baker,
well, they did
Richard
in the
Darby.
first administration.
First term there was. The Rex Tillerson, all those people said, you can't do that, sir. But this time there's nobody to say that. So in a way, he's kind of doing the things that Reagan fantasized about, but in the end was persuaded not to do.
Right. And Reagan could have, but one of Trump's valuable contributions to, I would say, presidential politics and the administration of the executive department in the future is that there are a lot of misnomers or a lot of assumptions that we are taught are just fact and that truly are not fact. For instance, when Donald Trump actually declared Jerusalem to be the capital, which it was, of the nation of Israel, every president before that had made that same promise, and they all got into office as Donald Trump did, and was immediately not called aside. Someone came to him and said, Mr. President, this is reason why we can't do this. The entire Middle East will blow up. It'll be, warfare, and blood will be shed and total chaos. But none of it was ever true, and he could have done it. And I think that there are lessons to be learned. Of course, we hope they're learned mostly by good men who will do the right thing. But still, as the president, you can make those decisions. And yeah. And what do you think? Go ahead.
Right. No, I was just going to say, it's a fascinating study in contrast and some similarities. I will say that Reagan coming shortly after Watergate, there is a different philosophy, I would say, on Trump's. Trump comes from that Roy Cohn school of don't admit to anything. Whereas Reagan was like, after Watergate, we all kind of learned the lesson after Watergate of Nixon had just copped to it. It would have been okay. He could have survived. And so you'll see Reagan with Iran-Contra, for instance, just going on TV and saying, I made a mistake. Whereas Trump is more barrel ahead and just get through it. So that's also a difference. But again, it comes from, I don't know what it's like to grow up in New York and to fight battles with all these people that are out to destroy you. And so a different kind of personality emerges out of that.
But what is the difference in our culture today? Because I do not recognize my country today in the 80s, as nasty as I thought the press was regarding Ronald Reagan. Today, our nation is almost unrecognizable in certain ways. And when I think about the murder of Charlie Kirk, for instance, and it seems to me that you need somebody like a Ronald Reagan to sort of right the ship or turn the QE, the Queen Elizabeth, around, because this mealy-mouthed, middle-of-the-road, uniparty, nibbling at the edges of reform and never accomplishing anything, to me, this has allowed the deep state and the permanent bureaucratic state to just grow for decades unrestrained, only in words, but never in deed, in cutting it back. And with Trump, in an era where it seems like black is white, white is black, good is evil, evil is good. Like the scriptures say, you need somebody who's going to say, no, I'm not embarrassed to send troops here into Washington, D.C. because we have a crime problem. We shouldn't have a crime problem, so we're going to solve the crime problem. And yes, when I said I was going to deport all these illegals, I actually meant it. And so following through and standing firm is really the only way to break this cycle of this downward spiral of America. But of course, I'm betraying that I have very strong feelings about where we are in America today. But I think Charlie Kirk's assassination or murder only underscored it for so many Americans who weren't quite sure until then.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this is not the harbinger of things to come, because I think Charlie really exemplified that Reagan attitude. You know, he had that good-naturedness about it. And whatever you think about him, if you like him, don't like him, whatever, he was just he wanted to talk to the people that disagreed with him. And boy, I sure hope that, I mean, when you shut up the guy that wants to talk, I hope we don't end up with leaders that don't want to talk and want to fight. That's the danger here. So I mean, I hope it was an isolated incident. I hope it doesn't continue on either side. But it's you don't want to shut up the reasonable people who literally sit down and for 3 hours will take questions from people that, say what he would say. I think he would say, like, the guy, if you disagree, come to the front of the line. Those are the people who don't want to shut up, and that concerns me. But I think that he had that kind of Reagan-esque quality. Even when people would try to get him to pick fights with his friends or enemies, he would say, I'm not going to pick a fight with so-and-so, I want to talk to them. And that was the Reagan ethos. And so, yeah, let's just hope that we can get back to that and hope this is not portent of things to come.
On that note, well, you've done a brilliant job with the movie, the book, recounting those 19 years, the story, which is very interesting in its own right. What is coming next for you? Probably lots of things that you can't talk about. So is that a dumb question that's going to get no answer?
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of rock stars that I want to give the Reagan treatment to. So I'm talking to them and developing scripts and screenplays with them. I always love to...
When you say rock star, do you mean rock stars or do you mean just, rock stars?
Rock stars, real rock
Play
stars.
music.
Who have great,
okay.
Yeah, that you would know their names. But, I should also mention, since we talked about rock stars, we have great artists in the movie and on these two soundtracks. And not Dallas Cooper, Gene Simmons, Kiss gave me a great song, Stormy Weather, in the Ron and Nancy breakup scene. All of a sudden, you'll hear Gene Simmons' voice crooning a 1940s song.
I love that song.
Bob Dylan gave us the ending over the credits, Don't Fence Me In. And Clint Black took us out with a song. And then on the we have a collection of songs inspired by the film. And I've got Tanya Tucker and just a lot. Of course, I mentioned earlier Lee Greenwood. Unexpectedly, the Commodores. I got the Commodores back together for a song, a love song, and so that was a huge part of the movie too. Is I kind of reached out to basically all the greatest artists of the last 40 years since the Reagan era, and kind of wanted to see who was going to respond.
Did they all jump at the chance to do the music?
Some did and some didn't. So the ones that jumped, Wayne Newton, one of Reagan's pals from Vegas, Mr. Las Vegas, I produced a song for him. Tanya was a lot of fun. Tanya had sung at Reagan's conventions and inaugurations, I think it was back in the day.
Oh, back in the day.
A matter of seeing who was going to respond. And so that was a lot of fun. So those are on Curb Records, and I think those are on
iTunes.
iTunes. We actually have LPs and CDs too, because it's the 80s, right?
How fun.
But yeah, it was a lot. I just love those because whenever I give a song or have an artist watch a movie and then write a song, it's always fun to see how they're going to interpret it. And so some people jumped on to the love story idea of Ron and Nancy, and others...
they used to make such terrible fun of her. And the funny thing is, you tell me how you feel about it, but when she would gaze at her husband...
The gaze, right.
I think well, firstly, she's married to this incredibly handsome, loving, just likable. I mean, and man, I mean, I don't think I guess if you looked at him as if he was a monster trying to bring in the apocalypse, like some are trying to apply, maybe you would not believe that. But don't you think that gaze was sincere?
She's a very complex character. And, Penelope Ann Miller, who I picked to play her, she just
incredible.
Handled her so well. But Nancy is an interesting person. In some ways, by the way, when I invited Mike Reagan, Reagan's son, to the premiere, and I just did not know what he was going to say because his own mother doesn't come across so great in the film. He's a tough character, breaks
Jane
up
Wyatt?
with him. And Jane Wyman, she kind of, breaks up with him and divorces him. And, Reagan said, I want to make it clear I did not want this divorce. So anyway, I'm at after the premiere and I'm kind of walking on pins and needles thinking I'm going to get cussed out by Mike Reagan. And he calls me up or texts me and he goes, "Yep, you nailed my mom. That's exactly the way she was." And in fact, he said when Reagan was president, Reagan had given a speech and he called his mom, Reagan's ex-wife, excitedly. He said, "Mom, what did you think of that speech Dad gave?" And he said, Jane Wyman said, "Son, I didn't like those speeches 40 years ago and I don't like them now." But she was a Republican when Reagan was a Democrat. It's important to remember back in the day.
Oh, really? I remember about the Reagan administration that it seemed like sort of a Trumpian time as well or treatment, obviously different. But if Nancy, she wanted some China. Her favorite color was this salmon peachy colored. I don't know if you know this story.